Ben has written that have stayed with me, but one stands out. Ben taught me that liberals, we liberals, make a terrible mistake if we don't speak hopefully about what we've accomplished and optimistically about our country. It's really true that we liberals rarely talk about what our programs have actually achieved. In the face of the attack on government, really up to right now, liberals often fell mute or pretended to be just as anti-government as the conservatives. Alternatively, some on the left, and Ben raised this himself, have worried that saying that certain things are working is a form of selling out because it distracts attention from what is wrong. And this is where Ben comes in. In a classic Wattenbergism, in a piece he wrote for Commentary back in 1972, he chastised liberals for saying, "Our programs have failed, let us continue." And I have always thought that's one of the best criticisms of liberal rhetoric I have ever heard, and I've tried never to make that mistake. So thank you, Ben, for that, among many other things. And then there's Ben on page 16 in his book explaining how he came to work with LBJ in 1966. He's describing a conversation with Bill Moyers. And I like the beach read description because this book really is mostly a narrative. And even those of us who are not neocons are enriched by the narrative, even if we disagree with some of Ben's arguments. But this is classic Ben. This is how he got his first job. Moyers and I chatted. I told him that Johnson should start giving, guess what, more optimistic speeches. I argued that everything coming out of the White House was about a crisis in the cities, a crisis in the environment, a crisis in poverty, a crisis in race relations. Yet there were plenty of census statistics showing that while there were indeed a lot of problems, there had also been much progress he could take credit for in America during the 5+ years of the Kennedy-Johnson administration. Crisis mongering was an oft-used political weapon on both sides in Washington, but liberals, who have suffered at the polls for their relentless gloom, employ it with much greater intensity. Wouldn't it be better to say, look how far we have come, let us continue? That is classic Wattenberg. Now, it's also classic in another sense. Notice that emphasis on plenty of census statistics, and Ben has already alluded to his love of the census. The other thing I absolutely love about Ben is his love of data. And I must say I sort of picked that up from him, from my friend Bill Schneider, from Carlin Bowman, from the late Marty Lipset, and others. I share his love of data. Ben can make the statistical abstract of the United States into a work of art. You know, in his hands, it's War and Peace, or a poem by T.S. Eliot. And have you ever noticed that Ben, in his writing, does not just report numbers, he italicizes numbers. He even puts little exclamation points next to the numbers he really, really likes.
Chess notation.
Yes, it's a wonderful thing. He'll show you the same chart again with everything but the numbers he really loves removed to make sure that you don't miss the central point in the earlier chart he has published. In this, he was a perfect friend and collaborator for Dick Scammon. I can't remember whether it was Dick or Ben who first came up with the phrase, but I think of it as the classic Wattenberg injunction to those trying to figure something out, and that injunction is marinate yourself in the data. Don't just look at the data or think about the data. Marinate yourself in the data. And if it doesn't sound too odd, I've had a lot of fun over the years marinating myself in data, thanks to Ben Wattenberg. I got to know Ben, finally, this guy I was obsessed with in the 70s, and he has always been a kind friend and has always told me smart and interesting things. In 1980, on the day, I had to write a piece for the day after the election in the New York Times without having any idea what the results were. And so I decided that I wanted to describe the electorate that had voted the day before. I love the same chapter, by the way, in Teddy White's book that Ben does. And so I called Ben Wattenberg. And two things about that conversation. Well, I'll just read a few paragraphs from this story. In 1970, Richard M. Scammon and Ben J. Wattenberg, the voting analysts, came up with what became a well-known description of someone they called middle voter. The middle voter, they wrote, was a 47-year-old housewife in the outskirts of Dayton, Ohio, whose husband was a machinist. A lot has changed since the publication of that description in their book, The Real Majority, and the new middle voter is someone slightly different. And so I asked Ben, who is that voter? And he said she is still a she, but she's now more south and west, so she probably moved to a suburb of Cincinnati, possibly one in the suburbs in Kentucky. Her husband is no longer a machinist. He's the manager of the produce department in his supermarket. He has a white-collar job with a blue ring around the collar. And unlike 1970, she works part-time as a bank teller. She is also younger, about 44, because of the 18-year-old vote, and the growing up of the baby boom has cut the age of the electorate. Before we're done, I hope Ben will give us a description of middle voter in 2008. But there was one other thing I learned in that conversation, which is I just knew that in that election, Ben Wattenberg, the loyal Democrat, was going to defect to Ronald Reagan. And so at the end of our conversation, I said, Ben, off the record, how did you vote today? And Ben did not want to acknowledge to me exactly how he voted, so he found, again, an ingenious Ben Wattenberg formulation to tell me how he voted. He said, I voted for the average number of Republicans that the median Democratic voter votes for. And I knew that there was a very conservative Democrat on the ballot in Maryland, and I pointed that out to Ben, and he said, yes, that's right, and that's when I knew that Ben had voted for Ronald Reagan. Now, I want to close. Well, there are two things I want to do before closing. I want to tell Ben something very disturbing about my obsession with the real majority, which is that without realizing it, Ben Wattenberg may have helped to elect a slate of McGovern delegates from the 10th Congressional District of Massachusetts in 1972. I was doing work on this, and I was asked to write a leaflet for our particular slate. It was just for that McGovern slate. And as a close student of the real majority, I decided that we did believe, as McGovernites, that we needed to end the Vietnam War to reorder our priorities. But in my leaflet for George McGovern, we wanted to reorder American priorities to put more police on the streets and to give them higher pay. And I bet we were the only McGovern slate in the country that got elected on a law and order platform. So I thank you, Ben, for that. And in the same campaign, the organizers of the campaign in Boston, who are a bunch of suburban liberals, which I now confess is what I am, had put together a leaflet which on the front had a classic George McGovern quote, I am sick of old men starting wars for young men to die in. Now, Ben had taught me to look at the census carefully, and I realized that my hometown of Fall River, Massachusetts, had one of the oldest populations in the country. There were a lot of old men in my community, so I didn't like the looks of that. And also, we were trying to show people how good McGovern was on the economic issue, which Ben had taught us was the most important thing to elect Democratic candidates. So Friend and I went into a neighborhood, gave out the leaflet with the cover, and it got the predictable reaction. Then we cut off the cover and gave out the leaflet, which gave out the leaflet without the cover, which neatly got rid of the offensive language about older people and his position on the Vietnam War. And we did that for the entire campaign. Thousands of these covers were on the floor of our campaign headquarters. That is all thanks to Ben Wattenberg and the real majority. So I thank you for that, Ben. On a personal note, Ben, as you know, thinks that we don't have enough children. He wrote a book about that called The Birth Dearth. And so it is probably another sign that Ben's urgent arguments have had such an effect on me that my wife Mary and I have 3 kids, which, as Ben would put it, is 36.4% more children than the average American family. That was a very good decision, and so I thank you for that, Ben. The last thing I want to say is to focus on the last words of Ben Wattenberg's book. Last words come from Scoop Jackson's slogan, and the slogan was common sense for a change. Now, first of all, I want to say that is one sentence that I absolutely agree with Ben Wattenberg. I, too, am for common sense for a change. And Ben has spent more than 40 years joyously engaged in the public argument over what constitutes common sense and what constitutes the right kind of change. And even if we disagree on some things, I salute him, I admire him, and yeah, Ben, I love you. Thank you.
Madam Chairman, I cannot handle one more blistering attack like that.
I'm setting you up, Ben.
Well, thank you. I'm glad that Ben introduced the term banana, because I'm always nervous about attending a panel that has the dreaded words Neoconservatism in its title, particularly perhaps here at AEI. One journalist once mentioned to me, he said, you know, nobody calls themselves a neocon. And I said, well, I think you could call me a neocon. And he said, funny, you don't look Jewish. EJ brought in the college newspaper article, so I can't resist one-upping him on that. I believe we work for the same college newspaper, which with the help of Cambodian typesetters has made its full archive available on the web. And I had an article referring to, quote, the new snobbery of liberalism back in 1966, John V. Lindsay. So we've been tilling these same fields. But we're here to talk about Ben, and I think in Ben's own remarks and in EJ's remarks, we've seen two major emphases. Ben is an optimist, and Ben is a statistics buff, a statistician, somebody who loves statistics and brings them to light. And I think there's a connection between the two, if you are at least an American, and that is when you look at the long run of history. And Ben's taken a crack at that as well in one of his books, The First Measured Century, looking back 1900 to 2000. You have to be awfully optimistic about this country and what we've achieved. If you go back, go to www.census.gov, you can readily find out that we have expanded in 218 years, from a nation of 3 million to a nation of 303 million. That's pretty amazing. And we've done so bringing in all sorts of different kinds of people. We've done so with huge economic, technological progress. We've done so with a widening circle of liberty and freedom and equality before the law of our citizens. It's really a fantastic achievement. And I think one of the things that explains Ben's views over the years is that his love of statistics, his love of country, and the optimism, which is the sensible conclusion of what is the long-term trajectory of the country, enabled him to keep his head when everybody else went crazy. In those years in the White House, 1966 through 69, we had sort of wild swings of public opinion on things. Ben emphasized the issue of crime. And I think he was absolutely right about this. My own thinking veered off the track with the rest of the country. But in the backwash of the civil rights movements, the wonderfully successful civil rights movements, I think there was a sort of widespread national guilt and feeling that somehow society was not morally entitled to punish people. It was widely known, though people don't like to refer to it, that about half of people in prison, about half of crime perpetrators, and about half of crime victims are black. That was true then, is true now. And there was a feeling, and not just limited to liberal elites or the Democratic Party or whatever, but very widespread. If you look at the statistics in that period in the mid-60s, around about 1966, 67, 68, you find some very interesting things happening. Crime, as Ben mentioned, is going up at a very steep level. Prison populations are going down. Now, the New York Times for many years has considered it to be an anomaly that if you increase prison populations, crime goes down. They think that's weird. Other people, more sensible people, usually understand that if you keep criminals off the street, you will have less crime on the street. But the whole country, I think, really changed, because for prison populations to decline, That's not a single elite decision. There's not some nefarious committee chairman or